Coming up on today's show, The Athletic names a surprising cut candidate for the Jacksonville Jaguars ahead of the 2026 NFL season. We'll tell you who that is and whether or not I think he could be a potential cut candidate for Jacksonville. Welcome into Jags Now. My name is Cullen Brown, and I want to hear from you guys before we get into the bulk of today's show. Which Jaguars player do you think will be cut this offseason? Obviously, they're going to have to make some moves. They're currently a little around $11 million over the salary cap as we sit here on February 18th, but we'll see ultimately who they decide to let go this offseason, but I want to hear from you guys. Let me know which player you think the Jaguars will cut this offseason. Ezra Cleveland. That is who the Athletic named as a potential Jaguars cut candidate leading into this offseason, where James Gladstone's going to have to make some tough decisions on, players he's going to have to keep, restructure, give extensions to. And Ezra Cleveland was the name that he ultimately decided to land on. Let's get into Jeff Howe, who writes for The Athletic and covers the NFL. He had this to say on Ezra Cleveland. The Jaguars are $11 million over the salary cap, and they'll need to get creative this offseason to become cap compliant. The most they could say by releasing a single player would be $4 million for Cleveland, their left guard. They only have two more players who would account for $3 million in cap savings and four additional players who could net $2 million. If the Jaguars need more cap space to make an aggressive addition, they'd likely have to restructure deals for higher paid players such as Trevor Lawrence, Josh Hines-Allen, or Eric Armstead. And just kind of stating the obvious that we've talked about so far here on the channel, the Jaguars are not in an ideal cap situation this offseason. I mean, the cut candidates, which I'll give you kind of a full list in terms of who I think would be a cut candidate for Jacksonville. It's not a lot. Not a lot of obvious answers in that regard. So I do think it's going to be more restructure / extension based when it comes to freeing up money. Maybe some trades are involved. Who knows? But Ezra Cleveland is not somebody that I'm really considering the Jaguars cutting this offseason. When you look at his cut numbers, if they cut him pre-June 1st, the Jaguars incur a $7.4 million dead cap hit and save about $4 million. Whereas it's a post-June 1st, they get a $2.2 million dead cap hit and save about $9.2 million cap savings. So could they potentially designate him as a post-June 1st cap cut and maybe have room to sign some draft picks or whatever else in terms of later in the offseason? I guess, but why would you cut your best interior offensive lineman that you had this past year? I mean, you see the numbers on your screen. And over 1,000 snaps, all at the left guard position, by the way. 68.5 for his total offensive grade, pass block grade of 71.4, run block 64.6. Very respectable numbers. Gave up 4 sacks and only 3 penalties on the year. And like I said, previously mentioned, he was your best interior offensive lineman last season. I mean, there was a little bit of rotation, and, obviously Cole Van Lanen, who did it all last year for the Jaguars, played every position but center. He's kind of an outlier because he's locked in as your left tackle for the future. But then you look at other guys that contributed this past year for the Jacksonville. Ezra Cleveland, who we previously mentioned. You brought over both Robert Hainsey and Patrick McCarry, who we'll get to in a second. They kind of performed underwhelmingly this past year, in my opinion. Jonah Monheim, I thought, gave you some really good snaps at center, the rookie out of USC, and fellow rookie Wyatt Milum, who we'll talk about more here later in the show. He's a guy that has a lot of potential at that left guard, or at the potential left guard or right guard spot out of West Virginia, but ultimately, I don't know if he's had enough snaps in the NFL for me to fully just launch him into the starting lineup, but we'll see, obviously, when we get into training camp. But speaking of Hainsey and Patrick McCarry, so you brought in Robert Hainsey from Tampa Bay. You brought in Patrick McCarry from Baltimore, and they just didn't really perform that well. Robert Hainsey was solid, 62.5 overall grade. Gave up 3 sacks, which is not great for a center, and had 6 penalties. Did have a really solid run blocking grade, though, at 67.8, but Patrick McCarry just did not have his best year. Graded out in the low 50s, kind of across the board outside of run blocking, where he was mid-50s, and had 8 total penalties at the right guard spot. He also had the back injury that took him out those last 3 games of the regular season, where Walker Little kind of stepped in, performed admirably, and then he ultimately had to slot back in at right guard during that wild card game against the Buffalo Bills. And I know people are sitting there probably thinking, okay, well, why don't we just move on from Hainsey or McCarry? I looked up the numbers before we filmed today's show in terms of what those contracts would look like in terms of cap savings. You wouldn't really save that much. Hainsey, I think, is around a little over $1 million. And McCarry, you only would save about $225,000. You would actually incur way more in terms of the dead cap that you would have to face. So they're locked in for 2026. And technically, Ezra Cleveland's contract does give you an out this offseason to potentially move on from him, but in a season where you just went 13-4, you won the AFC South, and the offense looked as good as it's ever had under Trevor Lawrence, I just don't think it would be really smart to move on from Ezra Cleveland, who, again, was your best interior offensive lineman, in my opinion. Now, if they were to move on from Ezra Cleveland, Wyatt Milum would be the next man up. And you see the numbers on your screen. He only had 96 total snaps last year for Jacksonville. And I do think he has a lot of potential. He played, offensive tackle at West Virginia, has some guard flexibility, even took center snaps back during the combine and kind of before the whole draft process last season. And he graded out well, to give him his credit, 77.5 overall grade, pass blocking is 75.8, run blocking is 72.1. I think that, if he comes into training camp and it's one of those moves where, he is just wowing the coaching staff with how, he's able to kind of pick up blitzes, certain run blocking schemes. He's really picked it up well. I think that if he puts it all together, he is one of this team's future building blocks in terms of the offensive line, because Van Lanen and Anton Harrison are two younger pieces on the offensive line. At Anton Harrison's, I think, 24, and then Van Lanen's 27 last time I checked. The other interior guys, Ezra Cleveland's 27, and I think McCarr and Hainsey are around 27, 28, respectively. So they're not necessarily older yet, but at the same time, if you are looking to move on from one of them, Milum would be one of my top replacements for either Cleveland or McCarry, but I just think it would probably be McCarry just given his level of play last season. But those are kind of my thoughts on Ezra Cleveland, but I want to hear from you guys. Be James Gladstone down in the comments section. Would, or should, the Jaguars cut Ezra Cleveland? Type C for cut, type K for keep. Let me know down in the comments section. For me personally, and as I kind of previously mentioned, at 27 years old, I don't know if it's smart business to move off Ezra Cleveland given the year that you just had. Again, we'll see what they do ultimately at the running back position with Travis Etienne. But regardless, you'll have Bashal Tutin, LaQuint Allen, and maybe Travis Etienne. You have, a young receiving core in Parker Washington. You have Jacoby Myers, who's a little bit older, but still has got some years in front of him in terms of his NFL career. Brian Thomas Jr., who you're hoping to have a bounce-back season. And then Travis Hunter, who's going to be that kind of rotational part-time role at the wide receiver spot. And you got Trevor Lawrence, who's finally ascending and finally living up to that number one overall pick billing that he had all those years ago. So I don't think the best move would be to kind of derail the offense and remove such a valuable piece, in my opinion, as Ezra Cleveland. I mean, you could argue he's the third most important offensive lineman on the roster, which doesn't sound like the biggest thing in the world, but when you've got something that's flowing, I just don't think that if you were to remove him, the Jaguars would be in the same spot as they were last year. And when it comes to actual cut candidates that the Jaguars could move on from, I discussed this in a previous video. I trimmed it down from 5 to 3 just because two of the names I kind of was, hit or miss on, ruled them as possibilities. But these are 3 serious cut candidates that I think the Jaguars could move on from this offseason. Hunter Long, just kind of in a really crowded Jaguars tight end room. You save a little, about $1.5 million if you cut him. Chuma Edoga, I'm over the Edoga experience. I think he's at best your 4th offensive tackle on the roster, and I think the Jaguars in general need to invest at offensive tackle this offseason, whether it is through a veteran or a late-round draft pick. And then Eric Armstead's the big one that everyone's going to be talking about, but as we previously mentioned, he's got a $19 million cap hit this next coming season. He didn't have a bad year necessarily, but for that price tag, you better be getting some of the best defensive tackle play in the league, and Eric Armstead just wasn't that. Thought he showed some flashes of some greatness. He's also, getting up there in age, 32-ish years old, so I think the Jaguars should move on from Eric Armstead, probably as a post-June 1st cut, if I had to guess. But in general, like I said, I mean, you guys can do your own research. Feel free to go to SpoTrack or Over the Cap and, let me know if I'm wrong in any of this. I think personally that if you're the Jaguars, you're going to see more restructures and extensions rather than cuts. And again, maybe you throw in a trade or two in there. We know James Gladstone's not afraid to wheel and deal, but I mean, if you're thinking about it from just a, perspective of extensions, right? Parker Washington's a prime extension candidate. I think he really earned himself a big payday, although we'll see if the Jaguars ultimately decide to go that way. Brenton Strange, he's your tight end of the future. He's a really solid security blanket for Trevor Lawrence. I think he values him, and Liam Coen, that for that matter, in this offense. And then, Trayvon Walker, depending on what his number is going to be, I think he's a prime extension candidate for the Jaguars this offseason. In terms of restructure candidates, I know Jeff Lowe mentioned it kind of at the beginning. You don't really save that much by restructuring Trevor Lawrence this offseason. I think it's like literally $1 million. But Josh Hines-Allen could be a potential restructure candidate. So there's going to be some avenues that the Jaguars are going to have to get creative with in order to get under or get cap compliant, for 2026. We'll see ultimately what James Gladstone decides to do with this roster. But if we know anything, he's not afraid to get aggressive and make bold moves. I just don't know if the bold move is cutting Ezra Cleveland, in my opinion. Thank you guys so much. If you made it to this end, or you made it to the end of this video, I greatly appreciate it. And hopefully that means we did something right. So if you could consider hitting that subscribe button for the latest Jaguars news and rumors videos. And as always, Jags fans, Duval. We'll see you next time.